Thank you, Dale. This prayer list is long and getting longer. Appreciate the way you handled it. Today over at the Veritan, we're going to start a series of lessons over there on prayer. In case anybody wants to join us over there. It is good to see Dave Miller over there and Lily. And last week I went up to shake Dave's hand. He was sitting there and I shook his hand. I said, Dave, it's good to see you. And he said, he stuck his hand out. He said, I don't want to shake your hand. I just want you to pull me up. So anyway, it was good to see him anyway. Well, if you're following along on our schedule today, the title of today's lesson is Teaching at the Festival of Tabernacles. I do want to just say this for future reference. Next week is my last week to teach for a while, and they're going to bring in a couple other guys to give you a break from me. But I want you to know that this section we're in John from today, Kevin, this echo in here might drive me crazy because I'm hearing myself talk. So if I go crazy, you'll know what it is. I'm listening to myself. Anyway, so Feast of the Tabernacles covers the area from John 7 at verse 1 today, and it really goes all the way through the beginning of chapter 10 for the setting. The festival pretty well wraps up in chapter 8. But I just wanted you to know that this middle section of John, Jesus is there for the Feast of Tabernacles, and thank you, Kevin, covers, I don't really like hearing myself, and it covers all the way up until about the middle of John 10, where all of a sudden it says it's now winter and time for the Feast of Dedication. So anyway, it's a big section. And so I just don't want you to lose sight of the setting of where we're at. Feast of Tabernacles. It's October. Yes, it is October. October's almost over. But in October is the time of the Feast of the Tabernacles. It's also called Feast of Booths or Feast of Shelters. It's a celebration of the harvest. And some historians believe, and I think maybe accurately so, that our first Thanksgiving in this country with the Pilgrims and all that group way back there, they were borrowing the tradition of their Jewish friends from back across the sea, and the celebrating Thanksgiving, because that's what the Feast of Shelters or the Feast of Tabernacles is. It's a festival of thanksgiving to the Lord. Leviticus 23, 1 and 2, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies. God ordained 7 festivals to be celebrated each year. Practicing Jews and Messianic Jews today continue to celebrate these festivals. I think they're important. They're not Jewish feasts, they're God's feasts. He ordained them. These people still celebrate them. The Hebrew calendar is based on the moon, and so the dates move around a little bit from year to year, but it always falls, these fall festivals always fall in September and October. There are 7 festivals ordained by God. 4 of them are in the spring. Passover, immediately followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Next is the Feast of First Fruits, and the last spring festival is Pentecost. There are 3 fall festivals: Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, and the last one, Feast of Tabernacles. The October 2022, this year, the Feast of Tabernacles started, it lasts 8 days. Started October 9th, Sunday, October 9th, and ended Sunday, October 16th. So it almost coincided with our lesson here. Our schedule had been just a little bit different We're going to have this lesson actually during the time that it's celebrated. During this time, many Jewish festivals construct what they call a sukkah, or a booth. It's a temporary hut constructed for use during the week-long festival. Next year, I hope I'm more tuned into it, because I'll go down to the Messianic Jewish synagogue and check out their sukkah. They build one every year. They have meals in it. They celebrate the festival. It's topped with branches. It's often well decorated with themes of the fall harvest. It's where meals are eaten, celebrating their festival. And if the weather permits, people spend the night in it. It's very sacred tradition for these Jewish people. These booths are meant to be a reminder of how their ancestors lived during the 40 years in the wilderness. Leviticus 23:33, the Lord spoke to Moses, tell the Israelites, the festival of shelters to the Lord begins on the 15th day of the 7th month and continues for 7 days. There's to be a sacred assembly on the first day. You're not to do any daily work. You are to present a fire offering to the Lord for 7 days. On the 8th day, you are to hold a sacred assembly and present a fire offering to the Lord. It's a solemn gathering. You are not to do any work. You are to live, skipping down to verse 42, Leviticus 23. You are to live in the shelters for 7 days. All the native born of Israel must live in the shelters, so that your generations may know that I made the Israelites live in shelters when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Feast of Tabernacles is focused on joy, great joy. They have a lot of ceremonies. Every day they have a water ceremony where the priest dips water from the pool of Siloam, takes it to the temple, pours it out on the altar. This symbolizes the water that God provided to the Israelites in the wilderness. Each water ceremony is followed by a light ceremony, where the priests light 4 75-foot tall menorahs. These lights symbolize to Israel, to the Israelites, the pillar of fire that led them by night in the wilderness. The people are joyful for everything God has given them. It's a true festival of thanksgiving. Deuteronomy 16:13 through 15, celebrate the festival of tabernacles for 7 days. After you have gathered the produce of your threshing floor and your winepress, be joyful at your festival. You, your sons, daughters, male and female servants, the Levites, the foreigners, the fatherless, the widows who live in your towns, for 7 days celebrate the festival of the Lord your God at the place the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless you in all your harvest and in the work of your hands, and your joy will be complete. Still today, on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, the Jewish faithful recite a prayer which ends with this sentence: Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, for keeping us alive, for taking care of us, and for bringing us to this time. I would say the psalmist had this festival in mind when he wrote the words of Psalm 118, verses 14 and 15. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. Shouts of joy and victory resound in the tents of the righteous. The Lord's right hand has done mighty things. Feast of the Tabernacles is one of the 3 feasts that the Lord God commanded all able-bodied Jewish men to attend. So it meant a trip to Jerusalem, and that's where John takes us today. We're going to the Feast of the Tabernacles. I've outlined the passage today like this. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 9, Jesus' brothers in the feast. Verses 10 through 15, what people are saying about Jesus. Jesus is the talk of the town. And the third section, 16 through 24, Jesus tells us about his teaching. Larry's out of town. I've recruited Frank. I love the way Frank reads. He's going to read the passage today, John 7, 1 through 24.
All right, starting with verse 1 of chapter 7. After these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of the Tabernacle was at hand. His brothers therefore said to him, Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples may see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself unto the world. For even his brothers did not believe in him. Then Jesus said to them, My time is not yet come, but your time is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify of it, that it works are evil. You go up to this feast. I am not yet going to the feast, for my time has not yet fully come. When he had said these things to them, he remained in Galilee. But when his brothers had gone up, he also went up to the feast, but not openly as were in secret. Then the Jews sought him at the feast and said, Where is he? And there was much complaining about the people concerning him. Some said, He is good. Others said, No, in the contrary, he deceives the people. However, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. Now, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. And the Jews marveled, saying, How does this man know letters, having never studied? Jesus answered them and said, My doctrine is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone wills to do his will, he shall know concerning the doctrine, whether it is from God, or whether I speak of my own authority. He who speaks for himself seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. Did not Moses give you the law, and none of you keep the law? Why do you seek to kill me? The people then said, You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus answered and said to them, I did one work, and all of you marvel. But Moses gave you circumcision, not that it came from Moses, but from the Father, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. Now if a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry with me because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteousness.
Thank you, Frank. What version is that?
That's King James. King James.
All right. Thought I recognized a couple of verses there. Okay, good. Because some of the translations, which we'll get to in a minute, read kind of different than that. But I kind of waffle back and forth between the NIV and the Christian Standard Bible. But whenever I want to get serious and down to the nitty gritty, I break out my 1611 King James and study that. I'm so impressed with those translators back in those days, mainly because King James, being a Bible scholar himself, had those guys under threat of death if they didn't translate it right. And he checked their work. And so I just, man, those guys, I mean, they got their life on the line. So I know a lot of people kind of slough off the King James anymore, but I'll tell you what my daddy said, if it's good enough for Peter and Paul, it's good enough for me. There you go. So there you go. Anyway, my dad was a King James guy. Anyway, so much for that. So chapter 7 starts with after this. Well, that means a period of time's passed from all the things that went on over in chapter 6, which covered 2 days of Jesus' life. And so now some time's passed. We don't know how much time, but if we sit down and figure it out, we fast forward a little bit, we can figure out that now we're down to about the last 7 months of Jesus' life. John tells us that Jesus stayed in Galilee, because the Jewish leaders were in Judea. They were determined to get rid of Jesus, but his hour hadn't come. He was on a preordained time schedule. And so, he couldn't afford for them to get a hold of him and move things up, because he had a certain day he was supposed to die. He was supposed to be on that cross, as John will make clear to us later on. And I think maybe back when I get back to teaching at the end of this book, we'll see Jesus on the cross at the same time the lambs were being sacrificed. So it was all preordained. He was on schedule. So he stayed around Galilee for a while. But now it's October. It's time for a feast, a required feast, Feast of Tabernacles. And so John zeroes in on Jesus' brothers. So obviously, while he was staying around up in Galilee, he had contact with his family, kept up with his family, and his brothers said, "Leave Galilee and go to Judea so your disciples there may see the works you do." They knew he'd be going to the feast because it was required. They wanted him to perform some more miracles. It's hard to say here if they were being sarcastic and just taunting Jesus. Maybe they were encouraging some kind of a sideshow. We don't really know, but the text, John makes it clear they didn't believe in him. They didn't believe this stuff about him being Messiah. And but, nobody could really dispute the signs he did. He did these signs. They want him to go do some more. Maybe they had good intentions. Maybe they thought they were encouraging him to go ahead and fulfill your destiny. I don't know. And then again, maybe they secretly hoped, good, go down there and do this and get arrested and we'll be rid of you. I don't know what exactly they had in mind. It's hard to say. But we do know, at least, thankful to Mark, that these aren't just a bunch of nameless family members. Mark names them for us over in Mark 6:3, where Jesus was teaching early on and in the synagogue there in his hometown, and the Jews didn't like it, and they said, Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are his sisters here with us? So they thought they knew who he was, and it said they took offense at him. So we know their names. We know it's Jesus' brothers' names. We know that they also thought he was crazy. In Mark 3, beginning verse 20, then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard, they went to take charge of him, because they said, he's out of his mind. So all this Messiah stuff, they just didn't go for it back at that time. So Jesus' relationship with his family kind of reminds us of David's words, as David cried out to God in Psalm 69, verse 8, where it says, I've become a stranger to my brothers and a foreigner to my mother's sons. So Jesus had problems with his family, but fortunately later we find out in Acts chapter 1, verse 14, that his brothers did become believers, where it says all these were continually united in prayer along with the women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. So at least they came around. But Jesus was on his own time schedule. He was on the time schedule outlined by his Father God, God's time frame, not his. So he told his brothers, my time is not yet here. For you, any time will do. Jesus uses a different word for time here than he usually does when he's talking about his appointed hour on the cross. In next week's lesson, we're going to see that particular term in chapter 7, verse 30, where he's going to say, as they tried to seize it, they tried to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. Different word. Here in verse 6 of chapter 7, he uses a word about a suitable time to go to the feast. This word for time is the Greek word kairos, which is about quality time, not clock time. Quality time, not clock time. It was actually an archery term, and it essentially had to do with when the archer takes aim with the arrow and he sees that perfect window of opportunity to take the shot. That's what Kairos is about, quality. And so essentially Jesus is saying to his brothers, you guys can go anytime you want to, but I can't, because Jesus had a specific teaching opportunity in mind. He said, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify that its works are evil. You go to the festival. I'm not going up to this festival because my time has not yet fully come. After he said this, he stayed in Galilee. So he tells them, depending on your translation, you go to the festival, I'm not going. Then all of a sudden, the next verse, he goes. So at first glance, it almost looks like, man, what's Jesus doing? He's lying to his brothers. Well, we know that God can't lie. Numbers 23:19 pretty well spells that out. God is not human that he should lie, that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? But the context indicates, and Frank's version brought it out very, very good. So does the actual 1611 King James. The context indicates that what he was saying was, I'm not going up to the festival yet. In other words, my window of opportunity isn't here yet. King James says this, go ye up unto this feast. I go not up yet unto this feast. Frank's New King James brought that out also. I'm not going yet. You guys go ahead. I'm not going yet. So basically, you guys go on. I'll go later. Since his brothers didn't believe in him as Messiah, and they were probably making fun of him at this particular point in their life, I think we can probably safely say that if they felt like Jesus had lied to them, once they ran into him up there at the temple in his teaching, they probably would have made a big deal out of that. Hey, this guy's a liar. He said he wasn't coming. Well, that isn't what he said. He just said, I'm not coming yet. Next, John tells us what people are saying about Jesus. You know, I always like to get different people's ideas on Jesus today, because people see Jesus differently, you know. Some see him for what they can get out of him. Some think he's a good guy, good teacher. He was a great guy, but he wasn't born of a virgin. He was a great guy, but he wasn't resurrected. I mean, all that stuff's ridiculous to some people. But so people up here, they're talking about Jesus. The Jewish leaders, they were looking for Jesus because they wanted to kill him. It was time for them to grab him. They're sick of him. They know he's probably going to be there because it's a required festival. And so they're looking for him, looking all around. Where is he? But verse 12, I love verse 12 because it just makes us realize people were the same back then as they are now. People don't change, really. Technology changes and the way we do some things changes. But as far as the way people are, they had all sorts of different views. Plus, I like the way the NIV puts it. It says in verse 12, among the crowds, there was a widespread whispering about it. I always like that, you know, when people are whispering about somebody and then all of a sudden they enter the room, you know, so they just shut up. But some translations say they were muttering. There was people muttering about him. Some other translations say there was a lot of discussion about Jesus. So he was the talk of the town. Everyone would have known that these Jewish leaders were looking for him. And so they're just whispering around, talking about him. And some think he's a great guy, but some say, no, he's not a great guy. He's a deceiver. But the interesting thing is, nobody's going to say anything about Jesus publicly. They're going to whisper about him. They're going to mutter about him. They're going to talk under their breath about him. But they're not going to say anything out loud about him because they're afraid of these Jewish leaders. I mean, that tells us how much power these guys had. People were afraid of them. But no one would say anything publicly for fear of the leaders. I'm convinced that one of the reasons, if not the main reason, that people quit following Jesus back in chapter 6, when we had that hard teaching, and they said, who can accept this? This is a hard teaching, and people started good grief. That clock is wrong. No wonder I thought class started late. I was looking at that clock back there. Okay. back to the lesson. Anyway, sorry. Anyway, so they're afraid of these Jewish leaders. And so I'm convinced that's why when Jesus started teaching back in chapter 6 about being totally committed to him, they were, man, we can't do that. You know, these leaders are going to get us if we do that. And remember in John where he says the word, where he talks about the Jews, he's talking about the religious elite. He's not talking about your normal, typical, hardworking Israelite person. He's talking about the Jewish leaders who are the bad shepherds of Israel, and people were afraid of them because they were afraid they'd get kicked out of the synagogue. As we'll see in chapter 9, a few weeks down the road, following Jesus meant you're going to get kicked out of the synagogue. And to these common citizens of Judea, that would have been a big deal. Synagogue was their life. Synagogues where their kids went to school. It was their social center of everyday Jewish life. It probably even meant if you're kicked out of the synagogue, you're probably not even going to be able to get a job to support your family. You're not going to be able to earn any money. Not going to be able to eat. So we'll fast forward a little bit to John 9 just so we can kind of get a grip on how these people are afraid. Where Jesus has healed this guy that was born blind, and the Jews they're furious. And so they go to the guy's parents. Says, we know he's our son, and we know he was born blind, but how he can see, who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself. And his parents said this, John writes, because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. And we find out later in that same chapter that they kicked out the guy that had been blind. Down in John 9:33, this guy is talking to the Jewish leaders, and he's brave. He's not afraid. He said, if this man weren't from God, he could do nothing. To this lady replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out of the synagogue. When Jesus heard they'd thrown him out, he found him and said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the guy goes on and makes his confession. Who is he? Jesus says, it's me. And he worshiped Jesus. So these Jewish leaders who walked around town in their fancy outfits, and they had some fancy outfits. Their garb that they wore was unbelievable. These guys were large, and they were in charge, at least for a while, and everybody was afraid of them. Well, the Feast of Tabernacles goes from Sunday to Sunday. It's 8 days. The last day is the big day. And we'll get into that next week. That's the focus of next week's lesson. But at midweek, so day 4 of the festival, Jesus knows his window of opportunity is there. And so he begins to teach. He goes up to the temple and he begins to teach. Apparently he felt safe at this point. He was still popular enough that there was a lot of people still following him, not like the crowds there were, but they were still good crowds. He would have, if they'd arrested him in front of these crowds, there's a possibility of a riot. We know that that's the case because of what happened later during Passover, which Mark tells us about in Mark 14. Now the Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But they said, but not during the festival, or the people might riot. So I feel like Jesus here at the Feast of Tabernacles, which was taking place there in Jerusalem, and the big celebration, it was one of the required feasts, so there have been thousands and thousands, if not close to 1 million people in the city. And Jesus is teaching a bunch of them at the temple. And so the Jewish leaders are there, but they're not going to arrest him right in front of all these people. And it says in verse 15, these Jewish leaders, they just can't believe their ears. Jesus is teaching things about God that it took them their whole lives to learn. And they had to go to Hebrew school. They studied under the best rabbis. And they know Jesus. This guy's a carpenter, man. He wasn't in seminary with us, what we call seminary. He wasn't in all these schools with us. And but if these guys would have just not been so bullheaded, they would have realized anybody teaching like this has got to be from God. I mean, clear back in chapter 3, Nicodemus recognized it. Nobody can do these things unless they're from God. Nobody can do the things you're doing. Well, if we think back to Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, it pretty well describes these guys. They just couldn't think outside their preconceived ideas about Messiah. So Isaiah makes this prophecy, says, go and tell the people, be ever hearing but never understanding, ever seeing but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused, make their ears dull, and close their eyes, otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts. These guys had God standing right in front of them, teaching them. Jesus, God in the flesh, is standing there teaching these guys, and they can't perceive it because they've got their preconceived notions. They think they've already got it figured out, and so they're not going to learn anything. Which takes us right back to John in the prologue. Everything in John keeps going back to those first 18 verses. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world didn't recognize him. He came to his own, but they didn't receive him. And so the Jews were amazed. How did this man get such learning without being taught? I mean, these guys have got to be thinking, whoa, buddy. We didn't teach this guy. Where'd he come from? He's a carpenter. How could he know all this? I mean, think about how arrogant these Jewish rabbis were. They just thought they had it all figured out. And so Jesus, this last section talks about his teaching. He says, my teaching comes from the one who sent me. And so Jesus gives them now a friendly jab. If you did the will of God, you would find out that my teaching is from God. I'm not saying anything on my own authority. I think verse 7 may be the key verse to this whole first section, maybe one of the most important verses in the chapter, verse 17, because it talks about the desire to do God's will. Verse 17, anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God. The English Standard Version says, if anyone's will is to do God's will. In other words, if we earnestly desire to do God's will, God's going to help us find out what that will is. But we got to want to desire. We got to desire it. We got to want to do it. The Jewish leaders didn't really have that desire. They thought they already had God figured out. They were 100% zeroed in on the law. And they'd come to the point that they actually thought God was the law. They thought they had it all figured out. So they weren't really seeking to do God's will. It wasn't their desire to do God's will because they thought they already had it all figured out. Verse 18, whoever speaks on their own is looking for glory. That's exactly what the men in the fancy religious suits were looking for: honor, glory, and respect. But what most people just saw were a bunch of bullies pushing people around. And this is why Jesus was so popular. He wouldn't like that. All of Jesus' teaching was about bringing God the glory, the Father the glory. And that's how we should still approach it. Jesus goes a step further. You guys are big on the law, but you don't even keep the law Moses gave you. Oh, that had to hurt. Because these guys took their pride in their so-called knowledge of the law, and they loved being the religious police. And then Jesus just flat out charges them in front of everybody. Why are you trying to kill me? Typical of cowards, they deny it. Who's trying to kill you? You're demon possessed. So Jesus goes back to that sign in chapter 5 that started all this hoopla. He goes back a few months. And he admits it. Yeah, I healed a man who'd been disabled for 38 years, and I did it on a Sabbath. And then he brings up their hero, Moses. You think Moses gave you circumcision. You can't even get that right. Circumcision didn't come from Moses. It goes clear back to the patriarchs, in other words, Abraham. Now, right, it became, under Moses, it became a matter of law. And the law states that when a woman gives birth to a son, Leviticus 12:3, on the 8th day, that boy is to be circumcised. Well, that made an interesting problem. So when a male child is born on a Sabbath, 8 days later is a Sabbath. He would need to be circumcised. So the rabbis in their Jewish tradition, their oral tradition of the law, came up with this, and so the rabbis taught this, that circumcision is so great. Circumcision, it says, great is circumcision since it overrides the prohibition of the Sabbath, which is subject to strict regulations. This is why they almost worshiped circumcision. They knew that circumcision overrode the rules of doing nothing on the Sabbath, because if a baby boy was born on the Sabbath, the following Sabbath he had to be circumcised regardless of the fact you weren't supposed to do any work. So circumcision overrode the Sabbath in their point of view. Jesus points out how hypocritical they are. If the 8th day falls on a Sabbath, you guys are going to circumcise male babies, but it's not okay to heal a guy that's been suffering for 38 years that you people have ignored for 38 years. You've offered him no help, no hope. Stop judging by mere appearances. Instead, judge correctly. Get your priorities right. Get your priorities right. Jesus is pointing out just how pitiful these guys are. They can't even understand the intent of the law. It's about giving God the glory instead of taking every word literal. You don't have to take it down to the nth degree. They think they have it figured out. Well, they don't have anything figured out really, because in next week's passage, we're going to find out these guys haven't seen anything yet, because Jesus is going to go right up in the face of these priests as he teaches even more in the Feast of the Tabernacles on the last and greatest day of the feast, which we'll talk about next week, the importance that had to these Jewish leaders. As I wrap up, I want to just think back to verse 17 for a minute. I think that should be the starting place for anyone wanting to follow Jesus. The desire. If you desire, if your will is to do God's will, if your desire is to do God's will, that's when you know your heart's right. We let God know that our biggest desire is to do his will, and he's going to make sure his will is known to us. And regardless of our abilities, physically, educationally, whatever, regardless of our abilities, if we let God know that our desire is to do his will, he's going to put something out there that we can do, and he's going to help us do it. Let's close in prayer. Father in heaven, help us that the biggest desire of our heart will be to do your will. We just pray that we'll always want to do your will, and that we'll never think in our minds that we have it all figured out, because we still have so much to learn from you, and we have so much to share with others. And Lord, as Dale mentioned earlier in his prayer, we've got lots of folks who are hurting and sick, some who are scared because of their diagnosis. Pray that you'll comfort them, bless them, heal them if it be your will. And we thank you for every one of us that you've ever healed and that you will heal in the future. In Jesus' name, amen.